Has revived hope that economic stability can return to that war-torn country. On Sunday, President Salva Kiir and rebel leader Riek Machar signed a ceasefire and power-sharing agreement, and it comes almost after a month after Eritrea and Ethiopia agreed to restore diplomatic, trade and transport links following more than 2 decades of hostilities between those two countries. Meanwhile, Kenyans and Tanzanians today marked the 20th anniversary of the al-Qaida bombings of the US embassies in their countries that killed more than 250 people. The Southern Africa editor of the Africa Report, Crystal Orderson, joins us now via Skype from Cape Town. Crystal, good evening to you and thank you for joining us. I mean, the warring leaders in South Sudan, as I say, have signed this peace agreement, giving peace another chance. The two antagonists, tell me what their fight is about.
Good evening, Bongani. I think it's quite significant that finally there's a peace deal on the table. Now, there's been a war for the past few years and it's really devastated South Sudan. Of course, Salva Kiir has been in charge. His rival, Riek Machar, has been in South Africa, of course. He was present in Khartoum signing that deal. So what's at stake now? Everyone is desperate for peace. There cannot be a country in Africa that's still at war, where its people are suffering. So all the leaders have been pushing them very hard, including the United Nations. We imposed sanctions on the country. So what we see now, we can call it a government of national unity, because that's the term that South Africans are aware of. And so what we'll see is Salva Kiir will be the president. There will be 5 vice presidents, which will include Riek Machar and 4 others, and 1 woman. We will see more than 500 members of parliament and an extended cabinet of about 50 ministers. 35 will go to Salva Kiir's government. The rest will go to Riek Machar, and a smaller portion to other opposition parties. So we're looking at a bloated cabinet. But for the sake of peace, Bongani, this was the agreement signing Khartoum on Sunday.
Now, Crystal, it's yet another power-sharing agreement. We know those have been signed previously, but almost all of them have collapsed as, before the ink was dry.
Yes, but I think this time around, the leaders are literally in a corner, because a few weeks ago, the United Nations imposed sanctions on some leaders. There's also an arms embargo, so it's going to make things very difficult. Also, Sudan, their economy has been in absolute tatters, and it's because of receiving less oil revenue. They've since signed a deal. That oil is pumping, Bongani. So ultimately, Sudan's livelihood is dependent on this. And I think they pushed the two leaders to really get this deal signing. However, the US, who has historically supported South Sudan, are simply saying, this is a deal that's between the elites, between Riek Machar and Salva Kiir. They're not going to pay for it, because the big issue now, who's going to pay for this 550 massive cabinet? We're talking about security in Juba that has to be secured. We're talking about an army that has to be incorporated. So big money is needed for this peace process to succeed.
Well, you're talking about the elites. Of course, it's the common people who've really suffered after years of war. So many uprooted and dislocated, and of course, thousands have lost their lives.
It's been devastating, Bongani. I don't think we've touched on the humanitarian crisis. Firstly, people have been displaced. They've been pushed from their villages. Massive cases of sexual violence. The simple malnutrition of people. There's been, devastating. The weather, the climate change have impacted on food security. So we're simply seeing a country that's, from a humanitarian perspective, have been in absolute tatters. We're not even talking economically and just socially what's happened in the country.
All right, so we'll have to leave South Sudan there, Crystal. Let's look at now the 20th anniversary of those bombings in Dar es Salaam and Nairobi, targeting the US territories and properties there.
Quite a somber day for people in Kenya and Tanzania, because in 1998, of course, we saw more than 20 people dying and more than 5,000 people being injured. But it really, placed a spotlight on al-Qaida and, of course, Osama bin Laden. And I really think that's when the war on terror started. And we've seen the subsequent 20 years later, Bongani, Africa has really suffered. We see what's happening in the Sahel region. We've seen what's happening in Somalia. Not a week goes by when we do not report on a bomb blast or innocent people either dying or being maimed and injured. Even the president of Somalia, the prime minister, he's in hiding, or not in hiding. He has to live at an army base because of a potential attack. And then, of course, Kenya itself have really suffered. We saw that massive Westgate bombing a few years ago, and of course the attack at the university. I think Kenya has been able to have a counter-intelligence agency, and they've really had a strategy to deal with Islamists in its country. I think, unfortunately, in Somalia, we've not seen success. And, of course, the Sahel region, we constantly hear of attacks. So I think today really a reflection on 20 years later and the consequences of al-Qaeda in Africa.
I suppose one of the things all of this has brought to the fore is Africa's strategic importance. It's often forgotten that this was one of those incidents that catapulted Africa back into the political center stage as far as geopolitical imperatives are concerned.
Yes, and we also saw a lot of troops coming into Africa, and we see, for instance, Djibouti became the base for foreign military countries like the US, like China, and being located there because of what the instability in the Horn of Africa. And I do think that because of the minimal resources that certain African countries have had in the past, the war on terror definitely saw an increase in military resources. So we see, for instance, the African Union mission in Somalia. They've been fighting different insurgents. We've also, of course, seen Boko Haram emerging in Nigeria, and Nigeria military forces still fighting it. We've seen that have been very much a domestic issue. We've not seen foreign forces in Nigeria. But of course, the Sahel region, really, we've seen a lot of international troops with local troops, but it's not looking good for that region. And so clearly, we do see that in different territories of Africa, there's almost like been a different strategy. In West Africa, we've seen a particular impact of how the Islamist insurgency have fought that. We've seen in East Africa and the Horn of Africa a very different strategy. And then, of course, also in West Africa, in Nigeria, how Boko Haram, a homegrown terror group, have been able to mobilize in that northeast of the country.
Crystal, all of those scenarios point to what you might call state fragilities and other vulnerabilities that might allow, for example, for the establishment of cells or the recruitment of members. How important is the continent to jihadist strategists?
Bongani, I think if we look at, for instance, Somalia, for many years it was an absolute failed state. And we've often seen that the political leaders have come from elites, but it was absolutely imperative for the African Union and for the international community to have a stable government in Somalia, for instance, because for so long, if you have a failed state, you basically... it's gangster's paradise, to put it rather bluntly. Anyone can rule. And so it was essential to have some national government who's able then to negotiate. So what we see in Somalia, for instance, I think is very interesting because the Horn of Africa is so interlinked. So the peace between Ethiopia and Eritrea is absolutely essential because Eritrea have in the past been accused of financially supporting the Islamist groupings in Somalia. They've, of course, denied it, but the fact is that Eritrea has been brought into the fold to start talking to Ethiopia and Somalia. I do believe we're going to see some new news emerging from Somalia, especially with regards to the Islamists. Now, for instance, here in Southern Africa, Mogani, we now have in Mozambique, in the north of Mozambique, also the emergence of a homegrown local Islamist group. What's happening there? Is it because of marginalization of young people feeling alienated from the political and social elite in Maputo? We see massive gas reserves being discovered in that region. Are they feeling economically they're not going to benefit? And are other cell groups in the rest of the world seeing here is a gap, financially support these groups and have a homegrown terror group, which is of course quite dangerous if we look at, say, a country like Mozambique, who have just, come out of a war a few years ago, don't know much of how to deal with Islamists, and we now see the international community coming to their defense to assist them in dealing with this homegrown terror cell.
Lastly, and very quickly, 20 years later, what has this meant for U.S. influence on the continent?
I think in East Africa, of course, Kenya has maintained its relationship with the U.S. I think it's grown from strength to strength with regards to supporting them with these terror attacks that they've had since 1998. Of course, I don't think we've seen the emergence in Tanzania. It's been relatively peaceful. Ethiopia and the U.S. still have, quite close relations. Of course, it's not been great for South Sudan. I do think under Trump, unfortunately, Bongani, it's a very different relationship. If we had spoken of a Democratic president, Barack Obama or Bill Clinton for that matter, even George W. Bush, it was a very different relation, one of supporting the African Union troops, providing financial assistance. I don't think under Trump that is going to stay the same.
All right, we'll have to leave it there with Crystal Orderson on Skype there from Cape Town. Crystal Orderson, of course, the Southern Africa editor of the Africa Report. You can join us again next week for this new feature, Eye on Africa, as we look at the dominant stories on the continent. Stay with us. Your sport is next after this break.